What's up everyone? Today I'm going to show you how I make the three most essential jigs in my shop, and they're all shooting boards. The first shooting board will be for cutting 45 and 90-degree angles. The second is a mitered shooting board that I use mostly for building boxes. And the last one's another version of a mitered shooting board, sometimes called a donkey ear. It's great for shooting 45s on moldings and box miters, especially when you've built the project with only hand tools. All these jigs are going to be made with offcuts and leftover lumber. For the first general use shooting board, I'll be using some 1/2 and 3/4 inch plywood and a scrap of oak. The base of the jig is going to be made of the 3/4 inch plywood, so I'm measuring out the hand planes that I'm going to use with this so that I can make the track that'll sit on the side of that base, and this will help me determine how big the 3/4 inch piece of plywood needs to be and the 1/2 inch piece of plywood that's going to sit on top of it. Then I'll get the upper and lower bases cut over at the table saw and spend a little bit of time making sure that each cut came out square and true. The next step is to glue the upper and lower bases together. I'll get everything lined up and apply some glue. I'll try not to put too much glue on. I don't want anything to squeeze out where the hand plane's going to ride. And once I have everything set where I want it, I'll hold it in place with some clamps. While the glue dries on the base, I'll cut the stop to the proper length at the miter saw. Here I'm marking out a center line and locations where I'm going to put some screws. Then I can come back with my drill and put in some countersunk pilot holes. It's a good idea to plane in a small chamfer at the bottom of the stop where the workpiece is going to register against. Creating a small chamfer gives the sawdust and shavings a place to sit instead of getting stuck between your workpiece and the stop, causing the workpiece to not be square. Now I can apply some glue to the bottom of the stop. Make sure that that chamfer I just created is facing the base of the shooting board, and then put everything in place and start a couple screws. I'm going to use my combination square throughout this whole process over and over again to make sure that the stop is square to the track that the hand plane is going to ride to. Here I'm just cutting off another scrap piece of the 3/4 inch plywood, and I'll screw that to the bottom of the shooting board to act as a hook and register up against my workbench just to make sure nothing slides around when it's in use. And that's all you need for a general use shooting board that you need to square up edges on boards with. These next couple of steps will make it to where I can shoot accurate 45s with this shooting board. And I'll start by marking out a 45-degree angle on one of the 3/4 inch pieces of scrap plywood. I'll take it over to my miter saw and make sure that I cut a good accurate 45. Bring it back to the shooting board and make sure that everything lines up and that none of the points of that 45 hang out over the edge of the track where the plane's going to ride. And then here I'm creating just a little backstop or a fence piece, I guess, that I'm going to attach to the back of this piece of 45 just to make it register against the back of the shooting board. I'll apply that with a little bit of glue and some nails. Then I'll use my combination square to make sure that this stop is 45 degrees to the track that the hand plane is going to ride in. Now I'm ready to give this shooting board a try. I'll start by applying a little bit of paste wax to the track that the hand plane is going to ride in. Then I'll take a few passes of just the hand plane up against the upper base to wear a groove into it. Here I'm cutting a little chamfer in the back of the stop. This will keep the hand plane from making that stop blow out when in use. And then I can start to make some test cuts and check to make sure that the board comes out square. Once I know I got the 90-degree portion all worked out, I'll bring in the 45-degree stop, get it installed to the shooting board, add some pilot holes, a couple of screws, and then start making some test cuts. I'll use my combination square one more time just to make sure everything's sitting at a perfect 45 degrees, and that's it for the shooting board. I use this next shooting board mostly when I'm making miter boxes. Even if I'm making the project with power tools, I'll still use the shooting board to tune up the sides, get the 45-degree angles perfect, and take off any burn marks. Like the first one, this one's made out of a few pieces of scrap plywood and a piece of hardwood for the stops. And I'll start by cutting a couple of pieces of 1/2 inch plywood and a piece of 3/4 inch plywood to the right size at the table saw. Next I'll tilt the blade to a 45-degree angle and make some cuts for the upper base of the shooting board and a piece of the track that the hand plane is going to ride in. I'm also going to cut out a couple of 45s for the top guide of this jig, and then the hardwood stops as well. The lower base is going to be made up of a 1/2 inch piece of plywood. The upper base is also a 1/2 inch piece of plywood cut with a 45-degree angle in it. And then the track for the hand plane is a 3/4 inch piece of plywood, also with a 45 in it. I'll start by making sure all the pieces fit up, and then start applying some glue. And to clamp this together, I'm just going to use screws. So I'll drill out some pilot holes and get all the screws in. Once everything's assembled, I'll check for a perfect 45 in the track, and then I can start working on the stop. This part's what the workpiece is going to register against, so it's critical that it's absolutely square to the track. Getting the stop square to the track can be a little tricky, so I use this piece of scrap plywood with a 45-degree cut into it, and then it lays down into that 45-degree track on the shooting board, and I can use this to register my combination square against. I'll put one screw in, register my square up against that scrap piece, make sure that the stop is square, and then I can put the last screw in. Next, I'll add the stop block to the bottom of the shooting board to hook up against the workbench. I'll cut a chamfer in the back of the stop so that it doesn't blow out when using a hand plane, and then I'm ready to start taking some test cuts to see how good these 45s come out. To test the jig, I'll do a couple of different scrap pieces of wood and cut 45 miters into them. I'll put those two pieces together and use my combination square to make sure I have a good 90-degree angle. And as you can see here, everything turned out pretty good, and I have no gaps in the corner. Now you could have stopped there and have a perfectly functioning mitered shooting board, but here I'm putting a lower stop block on as well, and this will allow me to use the hand plane in either direction. And I'm also going to put a guide across the top between the two stops, and all this is going to do is make the hand plane ride in the track just a little easier. Once the extra parts are assembled, I can go back to making a few test cuts just to make sure everything's still cutting at a true 45. One last thing I wanted to point out here is that I'm using this bevel up jack plane as my shooting plane for this, and I do that because the low angle of this iron slices through end grain pretty well, but it's definitely not needed, and you can get great results with using just any standard hand plane. Okay, this last jig is another variation of a mitered shooting board, also called a donkey's ear, and it's also great for making mitered boxes just like the last one. It registers a different face, so if you're working with just hand tools and you're making your true reference face of the box sides on the inside face, this is the better jig for shooting 45s on it. It's also great for cutting awkward moldings at a 45 because it registers up against the fence just a little differently than the last one. And since I use this one for mostly hand tools, I'm going to build this jig with just hand tools. And I'll start by measuring all my parts out and getting them cut to size over at the saw bench. After getting everything cut to its rough length, I'll use my shooting board to clean up the edges and get everything down to its final length. Next, I need to get the fences and bases to the proper width, and I'll do that by ripping all the parts at my bench. Then I'll clean up all the edges with my hand plane and go back with my combination square and make sure everything's squared up. The base that the hand plane is going to ride in needs a 45 on it, and that 45 needs to be pretty accurate. So here I'm marking out with my combination square where everything needs to be. And then I can draw a line across the board, come back with my hand plane and start removing the waste. I use the 45 section of my combination square as I'm planing just to make sure that I get this 45 perfect. This is the base that the work pieces are going to be registered against, and it needs to have a 45 degree on one edge. So here I'm cutting that out with the hand plane and giving it a couple of checks with a combination square, although this one doesn't have to be as accurate as the first piece we cut. The stop for this jig also needs a 45 cut into it, so here I'm measuring out with a combination square, use my tenon saw to roughly cut the 45, and then I'll just smooth up the face using a hand plane. Unlike a typical shooting board, this board gets clamped into a vise when it's in use. So here I'm drilling some pilot holes into a cleat I can attach later. Now I need to start laying out how the upper base is going to attach to the lower base. I plan on using just some screws here. So I'll start by putting the two pieces together and making some marks. Take my combination square and run a line down the base that the workpiece is going to register against, and then start to drill some 45-degree pilot holes into it. Come to think of it, would this power drill be considered a hand tool? Oh well, I guess it is for this video. Now I can apply some glue to the cleat and get it attached to the base, and then I can put in some screws. Next I'll clamp the lower base into the vise and then apply some glue to the 45. I'll take the upper base and get it attached to it and then drive in some screws. Next I'll attach the stop to the middle of the board using one screw, and then I'll use my combination square to make sure everything's sitting square. Once I'm verified of that, I'll put the other screw in, and then I'll take the hand plane I'm going to use with this jig and then just swipe in or cut in the small groove that'll sit at the bottom of the base. Once everything's assembled, I'll take some scrap pieces of wood, shoot some 45s into it, and make sure with my combination square that everything came out the way it should. I'll also shoot some 45s and some leftover moldings that I made. I'll put the two pieces together, use my combination square again, make sure that I got a good 90, and here you can see these pieces come together well with no gaps in the corner. That's it. 3 shooting boards in just over 10 minutes. These are the 3 most used woodworking jigs in my shop, other than a bench hook, which is so basic I can't even make a video for that. I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you did, please think about giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel. Thanks. I'll see you guys in the next one.